The clinking of crystal abruptly stopped. In the dead silence of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, the heiress sneered, "Don't bother handing it to her, Lorenzo. She can't even read the menu." What she didn't know was that the girl in the apron wasn't just a waitress, and the ruthless Don of the Costa family was about to meet his match. The Maison de Verre on the Upper East Side was not simply a restaurant. It was a fortress of culinary elitism. Beneath the cascading light of custom baccarat chandeliers, power was traded as frequently as the vintage wine. The tables were draped in heavy imported fret linens, and the air always carried the faint, intoxicating scent of white truffles and old money. To dine here required a 6-month wait list, unless you were someone who didn't wait for anything. Clara Hayes was intimately familiar with the invisible lines of power in this room. As a waitress, she was essentially a ghost in a stark black uniform and a crisp white apron. She knew when to pour the Perrier Jouet, how to clear a Cristoli silver plate without making a sound, and most importantly, how to keep her eyes lowered. It was a Tuesday evening when the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, the air pressure dropping as if a storm had just blown through the heavy mahogany doors. Monsieur Lefebvre, the usually unflappable maître d', turned pale. The hostesses straightened their spines, their welcoming smiles freezing into masks of polite terror. Lorenzo Costa had arrived. He didn't just walk into a room, he commanded it. Standing at 6'3", Lorenzo possessed the kind of dark, lethal elegance that made people instinctively step out of his way. He wore a charcoal grey, bespoke Brioni suit that draped flawlessly over his broad shoulders, the subtle glint of a Patek Philippe Nautilus on his left wrist signalling a wealth that was both infinite and bathed in blood. He was the head of the Costa Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered in boardroom negotiations and federal prosecutors' offices alike. Tonight, he was not alone. Clinging to his arm was Victoria Rossi, the daughter of a prominent Italian shipping magnate, a woman whose beauty was entirely overshadowed by her venomous arrogance. She wore a backless crimson silk gown, her diamonds catching the chandelier light like shards of ice. "Hurry." "Table 7, Clara," Monsieur Lefebvre hissed, grabbing her elbow as Lorenzo and Victoria were seated in the secluded velvet-draped corner booth. "Do not speak unless spoken to. Do not make eye contact with him. If the water glass drops below half, fill it. Go." Clara took a steadying breath. She had served billionaires, politicians, and celebrities. A mob boss was just another demanding customer with a larger ego. Approaching the table, Clara kept her expression entirely blank. She moved with quiet grace, pouring the chilled, sparkling water. Lorenzo was entirely focused on his phone, typing out a message with sharp, precise movements, his jaw clenched. Up close, the brutal geometry of his face was striking. High cheekbones, a sharp, aristocratic nose, and eyes as cold and dark as a starless night. Victoria, however, was already bored and looking for a target. She flicked her manicured fingers against the heavy, leather-bound menu. The Maison de Verre was notorious for its menu. It was written entirely in traditional, archaic French. No English translations, no helpful descriptions. It was designed to intimidate. "Excuse me," Victoria snapped, not looking at Clara but waving a hand in her general direction. "What is this poulet thing? Is it just chicken? I don't eat heavy carbs, and I certainly don't want anything drenched in butter." Clara clasped her hands behind her back. "The volaille de Bresse-en-Vessie, madame. It is a heritage chicken from the Bresse region, cooked in its own juices with black truffles. It is quite light, though very flavourful." Victoria scoffed, rolling her eyes. She leaned across the table toward Lorenzo, who hadn't even looked up from his phone. "Lorenzo, this place is so pretentious. They don't even have the decency to write what the food actually is. Look at this." She shoved the menu toward him. Lorenzo finally set his phone face down on the table. He glanced at the menu, then slowly, deliberately, let his dark eyes slide over to Clara. The weight of his gaze was suffocating. It wasn't the look of a man appraising a woman, it was the look of a predator assessing a minor obstruction in its path. "Explain the chef's tasting menu to her," Lorenzo ordered. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that sent an involuntary shiver down Clara's spine. It wasn't a request. Clara nodded, opening her mouth to speak, but Victoria aggressively interrupted, snatching the menu back. "Oh, please, Lorenzo," Victoria laughed, a harsh grating sound that cut through the refined hum of the dining room. She looked Clara up and down with utter disdain, taking in the cheap shoes and the simple apron. Don't bother handing it to her. She can't even read the menu. Look at her. She probably thinks foie gras is a type of cheese. Just order me a salad with lemon on the side. Silence fell over their corner of the room. A busboy nearby froze. Monsieur Lefebvre, watching from across the floor, closed his eyes in despair. Lorenzo leaned back slowly against the red velvet booth. He didn't reprimand Victoria. Instead, he watched Clara. He was waiting to see her break, waiting for the flush of humiliation, the stammering apology, the submissive retreat of a minimum wage worker crushed by the elite. But Clara didn't flush. Her pulse remained perfectly steady. She looked at Victoria, then shifted her gaze directly into the pitch-black eyes of Lorenzo Costa. The cardinal rule of the restaurant, do not make eye contact, evaporated from her mind. For 3 years, Clara had kept her head down in this city. She had scrubbed floors, worked double shifts, and swallowed the bitter pill of her family's financial ruin. Before her father's bankruptcy, Clara hadn't just summered in Europe. She had lived there. She held a dual master's degree in applied linguistics and European literature from the Sorbonne in Paris. She was done lowering her eyes. "Madame se trompe lourdement," Clara said. The words cut through the silence like a freshly stropped razor. The pronunciation was not the stilted classroom French of an American high school. It was the liquid, melodic, fiercely aristocratic French of the Parisian elite. Victoria blinked, her sneer faltering. "What? What did you just say to me?" Clara ignored her completely. She stepped slightly forward, commanding the space around the table. She kept her eyes locked on Lorenzo, whose expression had suddenly shifted. The boredom was gone. His eyes narrowed, a dangerous magnetic curiosity flaring in the dark depths. Clara seamlessly transitioned into a breathless poetic monologue in perfect unaccented French. "Le menu de dégustation ce soir, monsieur, est une symphonie de la mer et de la terre. Nous commençons par un carpaccio de coquille Saint-Jacques d'Hokkaido, infusé à l'huile de truffe blanche d'Alba, suivi d'un consommé de canard sauvage clarifié. Pour le plat principal, le chef propose un tourné d'os Rossini, surmonté d'une escalope de foie gras poêlé, nappé d'une réduction de truffes du Périgord et d'un vieux cognac Richard Hennessy." She paused, letting the cadence of the words hang in the air. Lorenzo was completely silent. The terrifying mob boss was entirely paralyzed, captivated by the sheer audacity and the hypnotic rhythm of her voice. Switching effortlessly back to English, Clara maintained her icy professional composure. "To translate for your companion, sir, the tasting menu is a symphony of sea and land. Hokkaido scallop carpaccio with Alba white truffle oil, followed by a wild duck consommé. The main course is a tourné d'os Rossini, topped with pan-seared foie gras and a Périgord truffle reduction." Victoria's face was now a mottled, furious red. You little... Furthermore," Clara continued, her voice raising just a fraction, smooth as glass, "if I may suggest a wine pairing, the Chateau Haut-Briand 1989 would complement the earthiness of the truffle beautifully. Though if Madame is merely having a side salad with lemon, tap water will suffice." Victoria slammed her hand on the table, rattling the crystal goblets. "How dare you? Do you know who I am? I will have you fired. Lorenzo, are you going to let a waitress speak to me like this?" Lorenzo didn't look at Victoria. He didn't even flinch at the sound of her slamming hand. His gaze was entirely fixed on Clara. The silence stretched, tight as a piano wire. Clara held his stare, refusing to back down, even as a tiny thread of adrenaline spiked in her chest. She had just insulted the date of a Mafia don. She might not just lose her job, she could lose much more. Slowly the corner of Lorenzo's mouth twitched. Then Lorenzo Costa chuckled. It was a dark, rich sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It wasn't polite. It was the laugh of a man who had just found a diamond in a pile of ash. "Victoria," Lorenzo said. his voice dropping to a dangerous silken whisper. He finally turned his head to look at the heiress. The amusement vanished from his eyes, replaced by a cold, terrifying void. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are boring me." Victoria gasped as if she'd been slapped. "Lorenzo, get your coat," he commanded, his tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "Leo is outside in the SUV. He will put you in a cab. Dinner is over for you." "You're throwing me out? For her?" Victoria shrieked softly, her eyes darting frantically around the restaurant to see who was watching. "I am throwing you out because you lack grace and you are loud," Lorenzo corrected coldly. "Leave, now." Trembling with rage and humiliation, Victoria snatched her diamond-encrusted clutch, glared murderously at Clara, and stormed away from the table, her heels clicking furiously against the marble floor. Monsieur Lefebvre, who had been rushing over to intervene, stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth slightly open, watching the heiress flee the restaurant. Lorenzo turned his attention back to Clara. The table was suddenly very quiet. The air between them crackled with an electric, undeniable tension. He reached out, his large, scarred hand gently tapping the leather cover of the menu. "So," Lorenzo murmured, leaning forward. The scent of his cologne, sandalwood, bergamot, and something distinctly metallic drifted toward her. "Not just a waitress, then." "I am currently a waitress, sir," Clara replied, keeping her posture rigid. "Are you ready to order?" "Where did you learn to speak like that?" he asked, ignoring her question. "That wasn't tourist French. That was high society Parisian. You spoke it like you were born to it." "I have a degree in linguistics, Mr. Costa. I study languages," Clara said, giving him the shortest, most unrevealing answer possible. Before Lorenzo could press further, the sleek black phone on the table began to vibrate. The caller ID flashed a name, Bastien. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. He looked at the phone, then looked at Clara. A dark, calculated thought seemed to process behind his eyes. In his world, timing was everything. He was currently in the middle of a highly volatile negotiation with the Union et Corse, the ruthless French-Corsican Mafia, regarding shipping routes through the port of Marseille. His usual translator, a man he trusted, had been brutally murdered 3 days ago, a clear message from the Corsicans. Lorenzo understood basic French, but not enough to catch the lethal nuances, the double meanings, the subtle threats hidden in polite business negotiations. Without breaking eye contact with Clara, Lorenzo swiped the screen and put the call on speakerphone. "Hello, Lorenzo," a raspy, heavily accented voice echoed from the phone. Clara immediately recognized the dialect. It wasn't Parisian. It was Corsican, rough, guttural, dangerous. Lorenzo gestured to the phone with a flick of his fingers. "Translate," his eyes commanded. Clara hesitated for a fraction of a second. She was crossing a line, stepping out of the civilian world and into his, but the challenge in his gaze ignited a fire in her blood. She leaned in, keeping her voice low. "He says hello." Lorenzo spoke in English, knowing the man on the other end understood it. "Bastien, do we have a deal on the Marseille docks, or are we going to have a problem?" The man on the phone chuckled darkly. "Le port de Marseille est très agité en ce moment, mon ami. Les marchandises peuvent glisser et tomber dans l'eau. Mais pour 30% de vos bénéfices, nous pouvons garantir une mer calme." "He says the port of Marseille is very turbulent right now," Clara whispered instantly, her ear tuned to the exact pitch of the man's threats. "He says merchandise can easily slip and fall into the water, but for 30% of your profits, they can guarantee calm seas." Lorenzo's eyes flashed with anger. "Tell him 30% is a robbery. We agreed on 15. Clara leaned closer to the phone. "Monsieur Costa dit que 30% est un vol. L'accord était de 15. There was a pause on the line. Then Bastien spoke rapidly, his voice dropping an octave, laced with a very specific idiomatic venom. 15, c'était hier. Aujourd'hui, le prix a augmenté. Dis-lui que s'il n'accepte pas, ces bateaux trouveront que le brouillard à Marseille est très permanent. Et dis-lui que je sais où dorment ses capitaines." Clara froze. The blood drained from her face. "What?" Lorenzo demanded, noticing her sudden pallor. "What did he say?" Clara looked at Lorenzo, her voice trembling slightly. not from fear for herself, but from the raw violence of the words. He said 15% was yesterday. Today, the price is higher. He said if you don't accept, your ships will find that the fog in Marseille is very permanent. Is that it? Lorenzo asked, sensing she was holding something back. Clara swallowed hard. No. The literal translation of his last sentence is, I know where your captains sleep. But, in the Corsican criminal dialect, it's a specific idiom. Lorenzo leaned so close his shoulder brushed hers. What does it mean? It means, Clara whispered, looking him dead in the eye, they have already put bombs on your ships. They aren't negotiating. They're extorting you. Lorenzo's entire body went rigid. If he hadn't known that idiom, he would have continued negotiating, oblivious to the fact that his fleet was rigged to blow. He reached out and violently ended the call. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lorenzo sat perfectly still, his mind moving at 1,000 miles an hour, calculating the loss, the retaliation, the blood that was going to spill tonight. Then he looked up at the waitress. Clara Hayes, a girl in a cheap apron who had just saved his syndicate tens of millions of dollars and countless lives with a single translation. Lorenzo reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek black titanium card. He slid it across the white tablecloth until it stopped inches from Clara's hand. What is your name? Lorenzo asked, the gravel in his voice completely gone, replaced by a deadly, terrifying sincerity. Clara, she breathed. Well, Clara, Lorenzo Costa said, standing up. He towered over her, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the light from the chandeliers. Take off the apron. You don't work here anymore. Clara didn't move. The titanium black card sat on the table like a loaded gun. I don't work for criminals, Mr. Costa, Clara said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. Lorenzo stepped closer, invading her personal space. The sheer size of him was overwhelming, but Clara held her ground. You work for minimum wage in a restaurant that treats you like furniture, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. By tomorrow morning, Bastien's men will know who translated that call. They have eyes in the kitchen, Clara. They will find you. You can walk out the front door and take the subway to your apartment, or you can get in my car and survive the night. It wasn't a threat. It was a devastating reality. Clara looked at Monsieur Lefebvre, who was pointedly looking away, pretending he hadn't seen or heard a thing. She untied the strings of her apron, letting the white fabric fall to the floor. Within 10 minutes, Clara was sitting in the back of a bulletproof Mercedes Maybach, surrounded by silence and the faint scent of expensive leather. Lorenzo sat beside her, radiating a quiet, lethal energy. His trusted right-hand man, Leo, drove in total silence. For the next 2 weeks, Clara's world was completely rewritten. Lorenzo moved her into a secure penthouse at the Pierre Hotel, her safety guaranteed by a rotating detail of former Special Forces operators from Gavin de Becker and Associates, the real, hyper-elite private security firm the ultra-wealthy used when police were not an option. She wasn't treated like a prisoner, nor was she treated like an employee. She was treated like a queen. Designer clothes filled the closets, replacing her worn waitress uniform with silk blouses and tailored trousers. But the true intimacy between her and Lorenzo didn't happen in the glamour of the penthouse. It happened in the shadows of his war room. Every night, they sat over intercepted audio files and encrypted emails. Clara became Lorenzo's secret weapon. She deciphered Corsican slang, identified shifting alliances through subtle linguistic cues, and mapped out Bastien's entire smuggling operation. And as they worked, the walls between them began to crumble. One rainy Tuesday at 3 a.m., Clara was curled up in a leather armchair, rubbing her tired eyes after translating a 3-hour wiretap. Lorenzo walked in, handing her a glass of neat Macallan. He didn't wear his bespoke suits at this hour. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing a map of dark, intricate tattoos along his forearms. You found something, Lorenzo said softly, taking a seat on the edge of the coffee table, his knees almost brushing hers. Bastien is getting his information from inside your house, Clara said, taking a sip of the whiskey. The amber liquid burned beautifully. In the recording, Bastien told his lieutenant that the Costa family's shipping schedule changed. But he used the phrase, "Le loup a changé son manteau," the wolf changed his coat. Lorenzo frowned. So? It's not a French phrase, Lorenzo. It's a direct, clumsy translation of an Italian proverb, Clara explained, her heart beating faster as Lorenzo leaned in, his dark eyes intensely focused on her mouth. Whoever gave him the information isn't Corsican. It's someone from your inner circle, someone who thinks in Italian but is trying to speak French. Lorenzo's jaw tightened. Betrayal in his world was a death sentence. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was startlingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence he commanded. "You are incredible," he whispered, his voice dark and thick with an emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. A ghost in a waitress apron pulling the strings of my empire. Before Clara could reply, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Leo stepped into the room, holding a secure satellite phone. "Boss, Bastien wants a sit-down. Neutral ground. Tomorrow night." Lorenzo didn't pull away from Clara. He kept his eyes locked on hers, a silent communication passing between them. "Set it up," he told Leo. The meeting took place at an abandoned aircraft hangar on the outskirts of Teterboro Airport. The cavernous space was lit by the harsh glare of halogen work lights. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. Lorenzo stood at the center of the room, radiating a cold, terrifying authority. Clara stood exactly one step behind his right shoulder, wearing a sleek black trench coat. She wasn't just his translator tonight. She was his shield against the unseen. Across the steel table stood Bastien, a man whose face was a map of knife scars. He was flanked by 6 heavily armed Corsican enforcers. On Lorenzo's side, there was only Leo and 2 other bodyguards. Bastien smiled, revealing gold-capped teeth. "Alors, le grand Lorenzo amène une femme pour faire ses affaires?" So, the great Lorenzo brings a woman to do his business. "He asks if you bring a woman to do your business," Clara translated smoothly, her face an unreadable mask. Lorenzo didn't blink. "Tell him she has more balls than anyone in his crew, and tell him my offer is 10%, or I sink his entire fleet before midnight." Clara delivered the message in flawless, biting French. Bastien's smile vanished. He leaned forward, his hands resting on the steel table. "Tu es courageux, Lorenzo, mais ton empire s'effrite. Même tes propres chiens mangent dans ma main," Bastien sneered. "He says your empire is crumbling. He says even your own dogs eat from his hand," Clara whispered to Lorenzo. As she spoke, Clara's eyes darted across the table. Bastien pulled a silver Zippo lighter from his pocket and flicked it open. Clink. It was a distinct, heavy sound. Clara froze. Her mind raced back to the corrupted audio files, the faint background noise she had heard behind Bastien's voice on the wiretaps. Clink. It was the exact same sound. Suddenly Leo shifted his weight. He pulled out a cigarette and patted his pockets. "Hey," Leo muttered in English, looking at Bastien. "Toss me a light. I seem to have lost my silver Zippo." The blood turned to ice in Clara's veins. The wolf changed his coat. It was Leo. Leo was the mole. Bastien tossed the lighter. Leo caught it. In a fraction of a second, Clara knew exactly what was about to happen. Leo was positioning himself slightly behind Lorenzo. The Corsicans weren't here to negotiate. They were here to watch Leo execute his boss. Clara didn't shout. She didn't panic. She slipped her hand into the deep pocket of her trench coat, wrapping her fingers around the cold, heavy steel of the suppressed Sig Sauer. P226 Lorenzo had taught her how to fire 3 days ago. As Leo raised his weapon toward the back of Lorenzo's head, Clara drew the gun and fired twice. Pfft, pfft. The silenced rounds shattered the quiet of the hangar. Leo dropped his gun, his eyes wide with shock before collapsing onto the concrete floor. Chaos erupted. Bastien's men reached for their rifles, but Lorenzo was already moving. He moved with terrifying speed, drawing his own weapon and flipping the heavy steel table forward to create a barricade. He grabbed Clara by the waist, pulling her down behind the steel as gunfire rained over their heads, sparking against the concrete. Lorenzo didn't look at the men shooting at him. He looked at Clara, his chest heaving, his eyes blazing with a mixture of shock, adrenaline, and overwhelming obsession. She had just killed his oldest friend to save his life. "You knew," Lorenzo growled over the deafening roar of the crossfire. "He asked for the silver Zippo," Clara said, her breathing shallow but her hands perfectly steady as she reloaded her weapon. "He was the leak." Lorenzo let out a dark, breathless laugh. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, pulling her face inches from his. "I am going to kill every single man in this room," he vowed, his voice a lethal promise, "and when I am done, I am taking you home." Lorenzo broke from cover. The ensuing violence was precise, brutal, and over in less than 2 minutes. When the smoke cleared, Bastian and his men were dead on the hangar floor. Lorenzo stood amidst the carnage, his custom suit speckled with blood. He turned back to the barricade and extended his hand. Clara stood up, slipping her gun back into her coat pocket. She took his hand, her fingers interlocking with his. He didn't just pull her up, he pulled her flush against his chest, claiming her in front of the surviving men. She was no longer the waitress who couldn't read the menu. She was the woman who had rewritten the rules of the Costa family. And as Lorenzo pressed a fierce, possessive kiss to her lips in the blood-soaked hangar, Clara knew one thing for certain. She had finally found a language she didn't need to translate. Power. Did you love this story? The world of the Costa family is full of dark secrets, betrayal, and dangerous romance. If you want to see what happens next with Lorenzo and Clara, hit that like button, share this video with your friends who love a fierce, unstoppable female lead, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a twist. Drop a comment below. Did you guess who the traitor was? See you in the next video.